All right, you curious and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. If you're a regular listener or a subscriber, and by God, we love our subscribers, you know we love our panel conversations here for the depth and breadth of views they give us. We have an economist panel. We have a pollster panel that we heard from last week, a journalism panel, a policy panel, a Caddyshack appreciator panel. All right, that's a lie, but I'm working on that one. This week, we're bringing back the Chiefs for a record 6th appearance here on the pod. These are 3 former chiefs of staff to some of Canada's most accomplished heads of government. Tim Murphy, former chief of staff to Paul Martin, now the newly installed EVP and Chief Strategic Affairs Officer at AECON. Congratulations, Tim.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Ian Brodie is the first chief of staff to Stephen Harper and central to the founding of the CPC. Now professor of political science at the University of Calgary and father of an aspiring pop singer. Yeah, you have a song you want to promote, Ian?
I did Chloe Brodie Free. It was at Massey Hall last night. Yes. Wow. Thank you.
Excellent. And last but not least, Brian Topp, former chief of staff to Rachel Notley in Alberta, deputy chief of staff to Roy Romanow in Saskatchewan, one of the architects of Jack Layton's Orange Wave, today a founder of GT&co. Remember, this is a panel where we discuss issues from the perspective of people who think of them not quite as campaigners do, i.e. what would be absolutely ideal from a political sense, but rather what is possible to deliver in a governing sense. So today, the Liberal cabinet retreat in Halifax, what was the PMO hoping to get out of it in policy and political terms, and what did they get out of it? Immigration. How did this issue get away from the government, and where to from here? And finally, in the wake of the Liberal staffer revolt in Montreal, what is the role and expectations of exempt staff? So Brian, Ian, Tim, thanks for making the time with us late on a Friday before Labor Day weekend. It's great to see you all.
Good to see you, David.
Good to see you.
Yeah. Anybody got big plans for the weekend? You going out to Saskatchewan, Brian, to campaign?
I should be doing that, but instead I'm going to Montreal, which is going to be great.
Yeah, a weekend in Montreal in late August is a good thing, no doubt about it.
Indeed.
Right. All right, guys. So the Liberals just had their annual cabinet retreat. How does this type of gathering differ from a normal cabinet meeting? Brian, what's a retreat?
Oh, it should be where you get the press of in effect, daily business, the routine business of government, all the pile of OCs, all the routine businesses out of the way, and you ask yourself some big strategic questions. And they definitely did have some big strategic questions to ask at this retreat.
Yeah.
And it's reassuring to know that they were thinking about them. I'll put it to you that probably the most important thing they had in front of them was U.S.-Canadian relations. And there's a great deal of uncertainty there as the presidential thing plays out. And then there's a really big fact that the government of Canada needs to be thinking about now, and that's that CUSMA, the former NAFTA, has a reopener clause in it, and that we're going to be back at the table with whoever's elected in this U.S. election in 2 short years, in 2026. And maybe it'll just be a routine reopener, and maybe we're in for another round of existential trade talks with the Trump administration. And so the government was doing its job and thinking about that for sure. And, I think they are being wise in what they're doing. They're thinking about how to put together a strong Team Canada team. They're talking to governors and to Congress people now and trying and connecting with both American parties, very wisely so. And it's a file that's well worth watching, that's for sure.
Tim, Brian went right into an important substantive policy message. But how much of these meetings is political?
Well, I think it's a serious balance between the two. I know they had about 6 hours of the schedule devoted just to politics, right? That they were free to, have a frank and full exchanges, as they say, around the issues the government is facing, around the agenda, without kind of the overhang of any particular policy. What do we need to do? Where are we at? What's coming? What do we need to emphasize? What are we doing well and badly? Prepping for the caucus retreat in another month or so as well. So that was definitely on the agenda. You saw that in terms of some of the preparatory stuff. They fed out that we're going to be addressing fairness, and they made some announcements around the temporary foreign workers and the housing file and a few other things. So the political framing of the government was on it too, but there was unquestionably, as Brian said, some very substantive things that they were looking at. I think they probably had in addition to that Canada-US, which is important, a substantive discussion around what they're doing in the immigration file, where they need to get to, housing, and how, in essence, you match what the government's facing, what's it got in the policy window now it's working on, and what fine-tuning does it have to have, and then how does that all come together in the political landscape they're facing. And so I think all of those things come together in a retreat, sometimes aptly named, and in this case, meant obviously to provide an opportunity to frame a broader discussion of where they're going and the themes they want to emphasize over the next period of time.
Ian, is this one of the few opportunities ministers really get to have an opinion about something other than their own file?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't keep track of where all the ministers were this summer, but this will have been, I suspect, the first time that most of them will have had a chance to see all of the rest of them since June. So we hope they were out talking to people across the country and listening to what was going on, have some reflections on not just their own portfolio, but the direction of the government. I always thought, one of the academic slags against cabinet government these days is that cabinet's nothing but a focus group. But in fact, as we all know, a focus group can be damn useful and much more useful than your average cabinet meeting that's got, as Brian said, 20 MCs that have to be processed on Canada's adhesion to the supplementary protocol on phytosanitary, whatever the hell, for the transition partnership. Okay, great. And so, the fact that you're away from Ottawa, you're away from the office, ideally you're away from cell phone and staff and Twitter or whatever, and you've got some time, a couple of days sitting around the table, it's a chance for the PM to go around the table and let people have their kind of 10 or 15 minutes of say. It is difficult when you're back in Ottawa and there's a press of business and an agenda of 20 orders in council that have to be considered, to get ministers kind of out of portfolio-itis. Like, the fisheries minister wants to talk about fisheries, the trade minister wants to talk about trade. But you need a couple of times a year where the cabinet can talk as a collective group of political leaders. I like to think it was about team building and finding direction. You're trying to get the team together. You're trying to get everybody on the same page. And you're trying to find, check your direction for the fall against your 20 or 30 or whatever it is, most senior people, your most senior political people around the table. Not so much the individual transactional pieces of business. Are
they any good at that?
Retreats?
Cabinet ministers. Cabinet ministers. Well, cabinet ministers, are they any good at that?
I mean,
if you're looking to have a meeting,
yes,
that would reset your government and give it a new sense of direction and purpose and a fighting political chance, are those the people you would meet with?
You have to create space to let your cabinet ministers do that. And so this is part of, I think, the engineering of a cabinet retreat, is to get people out of the room who don't belong in the room. If there's some business that needs to be transacted, sure, you need some people in the room to do that, but it's best to get everybody else out of the room. It's important for the PM as the chair and the sort of scene setter of the meeting to say, here's some things I really want to hear from you about. And then you'll find out, it's whatever, it's 30 people or 40 people around the table. Some of them are better at this than others. The public is sometimes not aware of who's actually good at that, but there'll be some people who are good at that and you want to pay attention. And part of the PM's job is to ignore the people that probably aren't very good at that. But by this point, the government, if he doesn't know who those people are, who he should be listening to and who he shouldn't be listening to in that cabinet, they've got other problems.
You might get two things out of a cabinet retreat political discussion. So first of all, you get a general will, right track, wrong track. Right? If the cabinet thinks you're on the wrong track on something big, that's an opportunity for them to do it.
That's the sniff test, Brian. Like, does this sniff right? No. Yeah. Oh, if we can't convince 30 ministers, it's dead.
Yeah. And then the second thing is, and this is in this sense, the cabinet retreat is very similar to a focus group. And I think you would have had a fabulous cabinet retreat if you come up with one really interesting insight that nobody's had on your strategy team that you were just alluding to. Because, strategy team will tend to be a team, a bubble, sometimes a sealed walnut. And then you've got a group of 30 political people who have been, as we just alluded to, they've been out and about all summer. People have been talking to them. And if you get one person to say, just listen to this, then wow, you've had a great retreat. And sometimes that can completely change what you're doing.
I would say, David, that, I think the point that's being made about, you've got the daily grind of being a cabinet minister. And frankly, you're ushered from meeting to car to meeting to plane to hotel to meet, right? And your opportunity to gain insight in a political sense is very low. The thing about this retreat that creates, I think, a better opportunity for the kind of, insight that you hope you get and the discussion that you want to have is the fact that they were kind of out from Parliament, out from that grind to some degree over the summer, doing more of the barbecue circuit. And obviously with an election at some point in the offing, part of what they're, people are out canvassing the riding. The members have been told, go out and knock on doors, find out what people are thinking. So, there's an opportunity been created by some of that space for people to actually get a little bit of a sense of what's on the ground. Secondly, are they going to be, your ideal strategists as a group? No. Are some of them very good at it? Yes. Are some of them weak? You bet. And that going in, which I think was Ian's point. So you're looking for the insight from, a little bit regionally, but from those people who can bring it to the table. I do think you get that sniff test. And my guess is one area where that sniff test got applied and you can see the retreat is in immigration, right? That, this is a party that's staked historically. It changed the immigration rules a lot. And now it's retreating on a lot of those, back, frankly, to much of what was in place before. And I'm sure that was a sniff test reaction, like a test out of cabinet. Sure, some of this was happening before, but I think that's an example where I'm sure cabinet said, look, are we abandoning our values and our position? And they went, no, we've got to get out ahead of a burgeoning public opinion stampede in the wrong direction. And so that's one where I think this kind of political, nose in the air test of the cabinet can be very helpful. I also think there was a messaging set up and this, the calibration of how we deal with caucus, right? Because that's another big, important group of people. Maybe not a lot of strategists, but people who've got a community input to provide. And I think the cabinet ministers as kind of almost an intermediary between the PMO, prime minister, and caucus, they can be an important voice about, okay, well, how are we taking this to caucus? What are we expecting? And I think that can be an important aspect of this process too.
Right. Tim, sticking with you, I'm interested in how frank these conversations are. So let's start with this proposition. Would it have been acknowledged as a context for the cabinet retreat that the government is facing likely defeat? So would that have been an acknowledged context of the conversation?
So my expectation is that, if you're going to have an honest conversation, that needed to be on the table, right? That there's a challenge. Now, that being said, I'm sure you've talked to some, I've talked to some, there is part of what the cabinet was about was creating a sense there is a path to victory, right? So that means you have to acknowledge that we're in a spot where we're not in a victory mode right now, as is self-evident. If you can't admit that, then you've got a problem. So I think my sense was, we've been trying to move the numbers over the last 6 months. They think they've moved some underlying numbers a bit. Frankly, it may just have been 2 rate cuts that did it. But nonetheless, there's a feeling that some of the economic underpinnings are moving in the right direction. I think, there was, so I think to your point, yes, it was on the table. Was it kind of a yes and then glide onto how we're fixing it pretty quickly? My guess is yes.
Well, that's not helpful, Brian, is it? If they don't really want to confront that reality?
Well, look, we're talking about the core of the government, its political leadership. Is it all that helpful to get together and go, man, we're dead. This is over. I've actually kind of seen that happen. I met some people in Team Bob Ray in 1995. A little team of us from Saskatchewan were sent in there to go give them a little bit of in effect, a little bucking up, and half of them, I think, had adopted a campaign slogan that was the following: "Let's get this over with." and I just don't think that's what you owe the public. You owe the public your best shot. You owe the public, and as we've seen many times in politics, there's been spectacular turnarounds in politics.
But grounded in reality, though, Brian, right? Grounded in reality. I'm not saying they can't win, but they are not winning. Right?
They are not winning. And so your trick, the line you have to walk when the government is in this position, and look, I think we have all been in governments that are about to be defeated, is that you keep trying. And that means you don't sit around and say, we're done. You sit around and go, we are in trouble. So there, you're right. You have to acknowledge that you're in trouble. And then mostly what you want to talk about is, how do we turn this around? And that's where you're looking for those two things I was talking about. Right? Are we on the right track or on the wrong track on the issues that are before us? And looking for that one or two golden insight. If we did this, that maybe things would change, which is the genius of any focus group. And this focus group should have some ideas, especially coming back from a summer of talking to the public. This is where they earn their pay. Okay, you don't show what you got when things are going well. You show what you got when things are tough. And this is the time for them to show that.
As we near the end of our summer of fascinating and very useful tech series, brought to you by our presenting sponsor, TELUS, I have an existential question for you, Herle Burly-ites. Is a podcast still a podcast if nobody's listening? I ask it semi-seriously, recognizing that in the early days of this show in 2017, nobody was listening. But that was their choice, and I'm damn grateful for the audience we've built in 7.5 years. What happens when it's not a choice? More than ever before, there are extreme, sometimes catastrophic weather events that threaten connectivity. Good thing TELUS thinks and acts differently when it comes to technology. It's part of their culture. From an investing billions of dollars to build their network differently point of view, and from a humans pulling out all the stops to keep other humans connected in an emergency point of view. I want to focus here on one important way they build differently. Unlike some other carriers, TELUS has committed to fiber optic cables, replacing the older copper ones. Their aim is to be 100% copper-free. Copper may be cheaper, but fiber is just better in every way. It's faster and far more efficient at transferring huge amounts of data over longer distances, making it easier to do everything online all at once. Fiber is stronger and more durable. The optic strands don't degrade like copper, and they can withstand storms and extreme weather events. Flooding or heavy rain will not impact their ability to provide connectivity. They won't corrode, break, or short out like copper will. Plus, fiber is not susceptible to signal interference or data errors. There's just more fascinating tech wound up in every strand of TELUS's fiber cable, Herle Burly-ites, and more to come next week. As somebody who's moderated a lot of focus groups, the key to getting honest responses out of people is for them to trust that they won't be judged for their answer. How does that go over in a cabinet retreat?
Well,
Yeah.
It's always a...
Yeah.
Look, I think at this stage, so let's look back at the summer. Summer starts with a devastating blow to the governing party. If there was anybody still in denial about the government being very severely off track of a re-election plan, surely the Toronto Centre Rosedale was it. At this point,
St. Paul's.
Toronto St. Paul's. At this point, if those ministers around the table looking at their own opinion polls from their own ridings are not calculating what the year looks like if something doesn't change very quickly, then they probably shouldn't be at that cabinet table. I mean, these people, they're not political neophytes here, right? They're at the top of the political hierarchy here. So I think, yes, I mean, if it was the beginning of the mandate, the prime minister had 4 years and you're just coming off of an election victory and, you're at some cabinet portfolio you're okay to have because it's got a driver and some, title and some staff, but you really want to move up the next rung. Sure, you've got to be careful about what you say, be more strategic around the table. At this stage, I think the strategic around the table is, these people will have heard over the summer from every possible direction, family, friends, campaign volunteers, people they talk to, wherever they went. Either people are paying attention to the Prime Minister and what he has to say, or people have had enough and it's time to move on. And, their own, as the genius of the parliamentary system, everybody sinks or swims at the same time. If he's going down, they're going down. If you're losing Toronto St. Paul's, you're losing a lot of ridings that are represented around that cabinet table, and they know it. So I think the cost benefit, I get what you're driving at here, David, but this is a very different situation. They have a very mature government. They effectively wasted a year not moving the polling numbers very much at all, and ended the last year's political year by losing one of the safest Liberal seats in the country. I think that's got to change the calculation of the people around that table.
And David, I think to be honest with you, I'm not sure there's any utility in wallowing in the negative. I think everyone's well aware of it, to Ian's point, right around that table and otherwise. You just read a paper, read a poll. There really is, there's only three options in the face of this. You're either going to, there's change the leader, which, as some people tried, and it's pretty clear at this point that is not an option. And frankly, that's not an option you're likely to talk about in that context in any event. The other is, do we stay on this track and hope that what we're doing, has an impact over time, that externalities that are hurting us come to help us? Or do we need to change what we're doing for the public to get a sense of, so that we're doing something that drives a right track perspective? Okay. And I think that, frankly, you're going to be talking about those two solution tracks. You're not going to be spending a lot of time talking about the change leader, because it's just not going to be on the table.
Fair enough. So you're not. I'm not talking about whether you challenge the leader, but do you challenge orthodoxy that the leader's deeply invested in? Like, do you think it is likely that anybody around that table said, "We're not going to win unless we kill the carbon tax"?
Well, the way to make this work as a minister is to be enough of a pain in the butt that you are seen without appearing to be disloyal and disruptive. Right? That's the fine. You have to be contributing new ideas and look like you're a live wire without looking like you're a wrecking ball internally. And on the issue you just raised, they should be discussing whether the refunded consumer portion of the carbon tax is still good politics. They should be talking about that.
I think they did talk about that because I think they have some polling around, good, right, or wrong, I don't know, but have some polling around the impact of the change of the name, the clarity of it, forcing the banks and others to actually be clear about it on your bank statements, and the impact of that on where the carbon price is and what's going. And they seem to think it's improving. Whether it improves enough is a different question. But so I know that was on the table. I know that was discussed. Did they go as far as saying we're done unless? I doubt anyone said that.
I have a slightly different
so it's
read
not that frank. That's really what you're telling me, is it's not that frank. These people are pulling their punches.
Well, I have a slightly different read of that, David. Let me put that in a slightly different context. The future of the government's leadership and the key pieces like the carbon tax is either on the agenda or it is the agenda and people are thinking it but not discussing it. Because the alternative at this stage is it's September, basically September. We're a year away from the election campaign. All of those people around the table have any future in the job market to match the salary and the challenge of a cabinet minister are getting job offers right now, right? And so the question is, do I stick around until next October when the chances of me losing this seat are actually pretty good, and then I get 6 months severance or whatever it is, and I got to find a job? Or I can go be vice chair of bank of whatever. I could go to AECON. I could go to whoever's hiring.
Hey now.
Whoever's hiring. They need a dean of medicine at Queen's or whatever. And so the challenge the Prime Minister has here is, don't leave. This is turning around. And if he doesn't make that case, then you start to see the senior people. I mean, look, this happened to Harper, right? McKay's out, Baird's out, James Moore's out, because these people have got other things they can do, and you can stick around and be part of the mad dash of 20 former ministers all trying to get the vice chair job at the bank of whatever, all at the same time, or I could take the surefire bet now. And at that point, then you're into a very bad cycle of government personnel around that cabinet. Then those cabinets really are hard to turn around from the let's just get this over with theme that Brian talked about.
Right. Okay, so Tim, the one area where they did have something public to say is on immigration overall, and particularly on the temporary foreign workers program. So the number of people coming to Canada has recently become a major issue, and public attitudes have turned around completely, from most people supporting the levels of immigration that we had in the country to most people opposing the levels of immigration we have in the country. It's been linked to housing shortages. It's been linked to driving down wages, excessive demands on the social safety net. It seems absurd to me that we started with a housing crisis, then blew up the number of workers, students, refugees, and immigrants to a number many times the number of housing units we build in a year. Now they're scrambling to put that genie back in a bottle. So how did this issue, and I know you don't know the answer precisely, I'm not asking you to tell what happened, but based again on your experience, how does an issue like this get away from the government like this?
It's clear it did get away from them. And so your question is a good one. I think it's a mixture of things. One of which is, I think they, in a post-pandemic, environment where, I think there was anxiety about having enough workers. There was a clear, coming initially out of it, a clear talent shortage. You had, demographic pressures already happening in, the developed economies of which we were one, expertise gaps. I think, so I think all of those, and then you had businesses lobbying for temporary foreign worker expansion because they were looking at, not being able to pick crops or not being able to, that kind of, that their solution went way beyond that. But I think so you had a lot of individualized pressures that suggested you need, singularly crafted solutions for each. So I need a temporary foreign worker, and boy, this, international students is a great way to help actually fund underfunded institutions of higher education. And we need to expand our base permanent residence class in any event to kind of grow our economy to help maintain kind of a base level of demand that helps, keep us out of recession. So you have a bunch of individual, I think, silos of what feel like good policies. So in theory, they should have been, I guess, managed by the immigration minister at the time. But frankly, that policy suite still makes its way through PCO, PMO, into that cabinet table. And I'm a bit flummoxed that no one kind of put it all together and saying, holy cow, we're going from 500,000 people to 1.4 million in a single year, and that won't have, knock-on impacts. And I think, there was a clear failure of how government functions. I think I do blame the pandemic in part for it, creating a sense of crisis, frankly, undermined political and public service decision-making because it just stuff got pushed out, right, in a very urgent way. Broke the cycle of kind of normal process in government, how you decided, like, you tended to have moments where you decided where to do things. Now we have a process where you just throw it out when it happens. And I think all of those things accumulated to result in, and they woke up one day and they had 1.5 million people in the country, which was building on a bunch of other things were happening, right? Because in the housing crisis isn't just a demand problem. It's a significant supply problem too, right? Prices are going up. There's not enough land. The process is too long. Basically, in 1.5 years, we're going to have no supply because of all of those things, no matter what our demand is. So I view that as a failure, both a political and a public service process failure.
I mean, Ian, the housing problem was known to the government. They declared a housing crisis in their 2015 budget, in their 2015 platform, and they had a massive housing policy. Adam Vaughan, that's what he worked on when he was in Ottawa. So how did that escape the government? And I don't mean just the cabinet or the ministers, but as Tim says, this went through bureaucracies and privy councils. And how does this policy mess happen?
Well, we're not here for a partisan discussion, so I'm going to avoid a partisan discussion here. But let me be blunt. I don't think this got out of the government's control. I don't think this is a fastball that got past the government standing at the plate expecting a curveball. The first announcement the Prime Minister made after he became Prime Minister was to announce that Canada was going to be welcoming to refugees from Syria, which I'm not going back to contest that policy, but this first announcement was, we're a place of refuge for people trying to escape persecution and lack of opportunity all over the world. That's what diversity is our strength. The Harper government had run on. We have to be careful about this because they had 10 years experience of the temporary foreign worker program being exploited by all sorts of forces inside and outside of government. The Prime Minister set the direction here is that we want an open door immigration policy. Yeah, I don't think it occurred because it wasn't the top incentive was to let people in. And the temporary foreign worker program didn't come apart because one little bolt or one little cotter pin of the policy broke and suddenly there's people come to the country we can't accommodate. Once you pull into it, it's the students, it's the agricultural piece, it's the low-wage workers. It's, look, there's government programs out there where if you get a government grant for develop your business, you get a waiver on the labor market assessment. Don't pay attention to labor market assessments. Like, a lot of pieces of this thing changed all at the same time and all in the same direction. I don't think that's a case of, it got past PMO because they weren't watching. They had, the Century Initiative and all of the economic policy advisors of successive finance ministers saying, we need to open up the gates because we have a demographic problem. This is what we need to do. So I don't think it was like somebody said, oh my God, we went from 500,000 to 1.4 million. I think they said, we need more. We need more across the board. And yeah, it has implications for the capacity of everything here. Look, the sort of the scandal of this, I think, is we had 60 years across many governments of many stripes, developing the points program, governments from around the world. Prime Minister Harper's first G8 meeting. What did the other G8 leaders want to know about the points program and how you accommodate immigration in Canada at this scale? We'd like to know more about it. It was the one thing that Canada was known about globally as having success in the points program. And now the points program is in tatters. It was not a bunch of emergency decisions that were made that just got past the gatekeepers. The Prime Minister set this path in 2015, like the day after he became Prime Minister. And I think it should have been that people put up their hand and said, "Hey, hold on a minute. Do you really want to say that in an unlimited way?" Yeah, there was a breakdown there. But let me be clear: diversity is our strength. Canada is a place of refuge for people from around the world. That was the immigration strategy that he set 10 years ago, and now we have it.
So, the Liberal Cabinet retreat is on this week in Halifax, and our sponsor, CN, would like to take a moment to remind those in attendance of what the railway does in Nova Scotia. CN employs 400 Nova Scotian railroaders. It operates over 300 route miles in the province. It has spent $200 million over the past decade to build out its Nova Scotian operations and spends tens of millions in local communities. Halifax is the most important seaport on Canada's east coast. And right across the water from Halifax is Shearwater. Shearwater was established during the First World War as a base for seaplanes patrolling for German U-boats. But now it's the site of CN's Autoport, which links the Canadian market with auto manufacturers worldwide. CN's automotive division is vast. It handles more than 2 million fully finished vehicles every year. If you bought a new car this year, chances are that most of its journey to the dealership was aboard a CN train. Across its network, from Nova Scotia to the BC coast and down through the American heartland to New Orleans, CN operates 18 automotive transit facilities. The Autoport in Halifax is a big part of that. Mostly, it handles the influx of new European vehicles bound for Canadian and American dealerships. Anyway, as I have said here often, the economy of Nova Scotia, and of Canada for that matter, rolls on CN's steel rails. CN moves cargo, moves it safely, and moves it on time. You know, Brian, you've worked at other levels of government, and one of the things I keep asking myself this question. When we set a number of immigrants to Canada, we know where they're going to live. Right? Generally, we know if you let in 500,000 people, 250,000 of them are going to Toronto, another 100,000 are going to Vancouver, right? You know this. So why does the government not sit down with the government of British Columbia and the mayor of Vancouver and say, so you're going to get an extra 100,000 people this year. What do we have to do about that?
Yeah, well, as I was listening to Ian talking about the Syrian refugee thing, I was reminiscing about what that meant for the government of Alberta, because quite a few of them ended up in Alberta, and the federal government let them in with no discussion with the province or the municipalities about where they were going to go or what was going to happen to them, basically. And so they ended up in the already desperately strained network that is there for people who are homeless. And the province had to scramble to make more appropriate arrangements for them in many cases. But look, what we have here is an immigration system that was tested on a number of points, and two key ones, I think, were, driven by some very interesting developments around COVID. Employers in many parts of the economy discovered that very many fewer people than before were willing to do terrible jobs for lousy pay. And so rather than doing what you would hope that they would do, which is to try to provide better jobs at better pay, what they did was turn to the federal government and say, can you give us some, in effect, indentured servants that we can deport if they don't do what we want, who are willing to work for this kind of pay and these kind of conditions? And the federal government, to its disgrace, facilitated this in many parts of the economy.
Can I stop you right there?
And then one more point.
Right.
No, I'm going to just throw in one more thing.
Yep.
And meanwhile, we desperately underfund post-secondary institutions and give them something that they can do about it, which is that they can generate a whole new revenue stream by bringing in a lot of foreign workers and foreign students. And look, I teach a class at McGill, the Max Bell School of Public Policy. Half of the students there are foreign students. They're great. They're wonderful. They add so much. But God, those were big numbers, right, overall in the university system. And then when you abruptly stop it, as Quebec government is trying to do, for example, then you reveal how desperately we're underfunding these institutions. So those, I think, were two really key drivers.
Yeah, that's going to be a big knock-on effect as universities are going to be begging governments for money going forward.
Yeah, but that's partly a jurisdictional issue that the federal government isn't totally responsible for, right? Which is the provinces mostly are the funding vehicle for post-secondary. To be fair, they're not the only institution that was dealing with international students. There were some, pay for degree colleges that were gleefully joining in. But I want to actually, if I can, react a bit to something Ian said, which I think is a little unfair to the government and unfair to the policy tools that we use to help people around the world. This is not a refugee problem. It is not. It's got nothing to do with that. In fact, we have announced refugee totals that we've never filled. And so I just think we need to put that issue off the table. I mean, the numbers are actually relatively small. It's like 30,000 or something. So that's not the issue. Temporary foreign workers, I think that was a COVID-related problem. The government did respond to a business pressure. I think that's clear. That question of where you ask employers to invest in better wages, better conditions in order to be able to. What's interesting is obviously all of that fuels inflation, may be appropriate to be built into the cost, but that is a policy debate to be had, and the government. And the government responded by allowing more temporary foreign workers in. I think that the base point system. I think the two issues that I think, one of which I think was well intentioned, but I think is probably wrong, which does undermine the point system. And Ian is right about this. Was the exceptions to the point system around categories, which I think is creating a challenge to the kind of, historically a very successful system that did have multi-party consensus across multi-governments. But I think the biggest gap has been that international student built on provincial underfunding of post-secondary and community college education.
Okay, Brian, I'm going to come back to you because the point I was trying to inject with you was on your first question about your first point about the temporary foreign workers program. why would, I'm trying to understand what the powers are of lobbying and what the powers are of business pressure. So I'm trying to figure out why a Liberal government that is not known to be business friendly would agree with a McDonald's owner in Fort McMurray who doesn't want to pay $20 an hour and wants to bring somebody in from another country that they can pay $10 an hour to. Why would the government have ever agreed to that?
I'm going to be as kind as I possibly can be because we're not supposed to be partisan here. They were distracted by other matters, and so this ran on autopilot, and the autopilot was disastrous. And basically, I think you had the administration of this department. I don't want to blame officials. The government's responsible for what happened, but maybe nobody was watching it, and so it ended up being a yes machine, and it was a terrible mistake. And there is no evidence whatsoever that in this cycle that wages have anything to do with inflation. None whatsoever.
Right.
It's a profit-driven and price-driven round of inflation that has nothing to do with workers whatsoever. And so there's no macroeconomic or microeconomic case for deliberately suppressing people's wages. When you have a labor shortage, there's an opportunity for people to get paid better and for people to finally get a raise for the first time for many, many, many people in 20 or 30 years, which was the right thing to do. And in other jurisdictions, they have gone through that cycle without crashing their economies. But here, basically because the government was asleep at the switch. Again, I'm trying to be as kind as I can.
Well, honestly, if you have a different theory that you're not expressing, express it. I don't care if you're partisan. If you have a different theory about this,
I don't think this government, colludes with businesses to break people's pay as a political strategy. I just don't think that's not who they are. I think they just plain made a big mistake because they weren't watching. And it's an interesting example of what happens when governments are dealing with big crises. And, this government has been distracted for much of its term by externalities that prevented it from pursuing an agenda of its own. They were distracted by the Trump administration and the threat to NAFTA, which riveted the attention, I think, of the top people in government. Chrystia Freeland, for example, was full-time on the file for years. And then COVID, which riveted them. And this happened, off. And look, I have seen that happen. I have seen in government of Alberta, for example, when we were riveted by climate change and by what to do about it. And a couple of files really, really went sideways on us while we were watching elsewhere, just because we didn't have the bandwidth to watch everything. And it actually led to a shakeup in the government saying, we have to learn to watch everything. And this government has not been watching everything. And this is one of the consequences.
And David, I think it could be one of the things that happens in government, to Brian's point sometimes, is if once you've established a principle, the next step isn't that far down the road. I mean, we already had temporary foreign workers. We let in 20-some thousand a year. There were, farm field pickers from Mexico, stuff like, you could make the case that we shouldn't be doing that either, but that's, many parties have participated in improving that level of temporary foreign worker. And so, suddenly to be able to say, well, we're close to that because we're this and we can't find anyone, there's no one prepared to work, but people are lining up and we've got 40,000 people who are willing to take the 20,000 jobs. We can use them for, you can see that kind of, well, I'll take one more step and then one more step. And you wake up 3 years later and you have 90,000 temporary foreign workers instead of the 20,000 you started with. That doesn't excuse but you can see how in the normal process of governing that, one step, the next step can easily happen. And then suddenly the next step easily happens. And then suddenly you're well down the road and you never really intended to get there.
Yeah. Ian?
Especially in the environment, as Brian said, where you're, COVID's coming at you hard. What are you doing about the big things?
Right.
I think, let me add maybe two dimensions to this, because I basically agree with the past pressure here. Aside from NDP governments, and I will give Brian and his team a pass on this, other premiers speak to the Prime Minister and pass along their impression there's a desperate need for workers in their provincial economy I think there's been reporting about what the conversations were between Queen's Park and Parliament Hill in that regard, and painting Premier Legault as the obstacle to opening the doors further here to alleviate pressure in the Toronto area. Obviously, not understanding or not thinking through that for every person you let in to alleviate the pressure at the local Tim Hortons or McDonald's franchise, you're also creating a housing and other capacity problem in the GTA for sure. I agree basically with Brian's assessment of the business pressure here is constantly to have more people in at a lower price point for cost control purposes. Yes, I saw that personally when I was chief of staff. It's a constant pressure. What changes here, I think, is the overall ideology of the government, of this government, that diversity is our strength. Anybody who asks a question about immigration is a racist. And so when you ask the question, why doesn't the federal government sit down when you realize there's going to be 1 million people coming in next year to talk to the mayors and to talk to the premiers of what's going on? It's because that's the view. Is that diversity is a strength. The more diversity we have in the country, the better it is. If you ask any questions about our capacity to handle this, it's because you're working from ulterior motives. I think that is the enabling ideology that allows the government to say yes to this part of the external pressure from a lot of different directions to open up the doors. And let's be clear, the chair of the finance minister's own economic policy strategy agenda before he went to be ambassador to China was about, we need to get to 100 million Canadians, quickly. We need more people. This is the only solution to this demographic problem. It's going to solve the problem of capacity. It's going to solve the skills problem. It's going to solve the Canada pension plan, long-term solvency for all the Medicare programs and so forth that we have. And then they hired a bunch of people from this consulting firm to write the policy and to oversee its implementation by the immigration department. There were lots of people who should have put up their hand here and said, "Stop! We've got to rethink this." But I can't buy the idea that this was just a surprise to the government. Everybody was pushing on this in order to get this many paths of temporary immigration opened up to let the doors open. And yes, universities benefit. I think the community college program in Ontario is a much bigger beneficiary. Business wanted it, the premiers wanted it. But let's be clear, the government's ideological predisposition was to push in this direction.
But temporary foreign workers has nothing to do with diversity. It's built into the name. They go home. That doesn't fit.
Well, theoretically, we don't actually know if they do or not.
Well, yes, there might be an overstay welcome, but it doesn't. You can't be derived a diversity is our strength because we're intentionally going to ignore people who overstay on temporary foreign worker program. That's not palatable. I think it's fair to say that philosophy did drive some of the other changes that were put into place, and in the raw numbers. Not sure, maybe that pinned in part the foreign student acceptance thing, but I actually think a lot of it was a province-driven driver for allowing universities to find a funding source, and then it got out of control.
Great. Brian, anything to finish up with on this?
I was thinking about a panel I attended once that had a former prime minister of a Scandinavian country. And she had an interesting thing to say about this, just to sum it up. She said, "You know what? I find it very painful." This was before this, like 4 or 5 years ago. "I find it very painful to listen to Canadians talking about immigration. When you have one of the most restrictive immigration policies in the Western world, where you basically recruit doctors and engineers to drive your cabs, and you don't have a border that has mass migrants coming across it like we do in Europe. And the reason why the discussion in Europe has changed is because we have millions of people pressing against our border who are not doctors and lawyers and engineers who you have picked to drive your cabs. But one day this may happen to you, and then we'll see how the discussion goes in your country." And that's kind of what happened here. Since the good old days of the 20s and when we were importing hundreds of thousands of people to populate the prairies, Canada's never seen a wave of immigration like this. And when you see it, then you're confronted with what it means, and then your discussion changes. It's easy to talk in principle about diversity is our strength when we have such a restrictive and limited immigration program. It looks a little bit different when you have a year like this.
It's interesting to me, though, because I'm looking at a lot of polling about this. And even though Canadians' attitudes on immigration have changed, on the number of people coming to the country have changed, they haven't changed their opinions about whether diversity is our strength, for example. And it doesn't feel to me the same as what's going on in Europe, or maybe even in Quebec. What's going on in Europe is a feeling by the population that their countries are existentially challenged, that France will no longer be France, that Germany will no longer be Germany. I don't get the sense that anything like that is happening in English Canada, even as attitudes about immigration move. Rather, it's much more practical. It's that we don't have houses for these people. We don't have jobs for these people, right? It's too many people right now for the practically. That feels quite different and hopeful to me.
I think you're absolutely right. You can find replacement theory, in the angry right, but I think in the English Canadian mainstream, they're not worrying about replacement. They're worrying about housing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's time to pull this back, David. I mean, we don't have the video. When people show up at Pearson on a temporary foreign worker permit to go work wherever they're going to work, they come a couple of people at a time on each flight from wherever they're coming from. We don't have the videotapes that Europe had of the eastern frontier, the southeastern frontier of the Schengen area, and we don't have the same videotape that the United States has of people just floating across the Rio Grande. So in that sense, we don't quite have the galvanizing, visual just yet. The longer this goes on, the closer we might get to it. I should also say, we also have on the conservative side of the spectrum, we're fortunate, I think. Jason Kenney went around to convince people for years that conservatively minded people have nothing to fear from regulated immigration, because immigrants are more likely to be conservative in some senses than the median Canadian voter, and that helped to diffuse some of this. But again, that case was kind of 12 years ago, and I got to believe if we take another 2 or 3 years or 4 years of million, 5 people a year without housing, without doctors, without medical capacity, all of this is very, very, very fragile and will come apart.
Right.
I do take some solace, David, in your point, and even the critique Monsieur Poilievre has launched against the government is ultimately an economic and practical critique of what it's done. Like the rhetoric he uses is you've balled this up economically. It puts pressure on housing, the economy, and he's not engaging in the kind of rhetoric we've seen in some of the European nations. That doesn't mean if this goes on, but I do take solace is that there is ultimately still in the political environment an underlying consensus around the need for a managed immigration of some significance. It's the excess that's being attacked, and that gives me some hope that that if we do get this under control, we can get it under control from a public opinion point of view too.
All right, my last topic. I'm so looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say about this. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this. This week, a substantial number of people, 52, I think, working in Liberal ministers' offices, signed a letter saying that they were so strongly in disagreement with the government's policy toward Israel, Hamas, and Gaza that they would not be volunteering their time in the crucial upcoming by-election in Montreal. I have thoughts, but I want to hear yours first, which is, let's start with, what is the role of what are called exempt staff? Ian, you want to start us off? You're the political scientist.
Yeah, let me start with the political science explanation. I'll try and get a more vernacular explanation here. Every government is led by a group of partisan ministers. The current group are there because they're liberals. The previous group are there because they're conservatives. The next group could be there because they're New Democrats or whoever. We'll see. Ministers are entitled by law and by common sense of politics to have around them a few political aides to help them with the political work that they have to do, who are there because they have some kind of an allegiance to the governing party. Or if not allegiance to the governing party, at least the minister can get rid of them for reasons as they see fit. They don't have the same job protections as civil servants. And they've been going on, for 60 years. I don't think there's always questions about this, but I don't have any particular problem with the system. Mostly people who are there right now should be there because they're good liberals, and they share the kind of the political allegiance to the government's future, and you can take that narrowly or broadly. In their spare time, political staff are expected to volunteer for the governing party. And in this case, given there's a by-election only 2 hours away, or whatever it is, 2 hours and 10 minutes away from Parliament Hill, I assume that the Liberal campaign was expected to have an infusion of exempt staffers and parliamentary staffers come down from Ottawa to help with the door-to-door and the canvassing and so on and so forth. And I think this is also, by the way, a good way of keeping political staff in touch with the realities of going door-to-door and what voters think in this particular right. It's not a sample of all Canadians in this riding, but it's good every so often to go down and do some door knocking with some people who don't pay that much attention to politics day to day. Every party, I think, has internal pressures or cross pressures of this sort that you have to manage. So I may surprise you, David, with my view on this topic, but in my day, we had people who had a lot of different views about abortion inside the Conservative exempt staff. As much as I expected exempt staff to help out with party activities in their spare time, people would walk, there's a limit to how far you can push that. In this case, my surprise is not that there are political staffers in the Liberal offices who disagree with the government's position on Israel, Gaza, or any one of 6, 7 other issues in a very profound way. What surprises me is that in some case, at some point, this was not managed behind closed doors in a way that just said, yeah, okay, we get that. We've got some other things that we can expect you to do here. Understand that, rather than pushing people to the point where they put pen to paper here. It could be, I don't know the staffers involved here, but I've known other staffers who were in similar positions in the past. It could just be that they had outsized expectations of what their role would be as political staffers, or in some senses thought perhaps that somebody cares what political staffers' political views are, which I don't think anybody should particularly. And so, I don't really care what a group of 52 political staffers for the Liberal Party have to say in a letter. What I think is surprising here is that something inside the political staff management of the Trudeau government went wrong here, to the point where these people felt that there was in their interest to write a public letter. But I'm genuinely puzzled by this, because I don't know the background here, but I've been in a similar situation with similar sorts of issues in the past. And you do want to treat your staff well enough that they don't feel they need a public rebellion. But again, I don't know enough here to understand the background. So it could be there's something else at play in this instance.
Brian, it feels like they've misunderstood their role. I mean, if you're working for a minister, you're not a party activist anymore. You're not a policy activist anymore. You're not even entitled to a fucking opinion, right? You're serving somebody.
Yeah. Well, look, the first thing I want to say is the NDP candidate in LaSalle-Mart is a guy named Craig Sauvé. He's a buddy of mine, and he's going to be a great MP. So I'm looking forward to his election. I'm grateful to those 52 staffers for their contribution. Look,
there it is, right there. There it is, right there.
And I thought you'd think that. Look, when I went to go work in the cathedral of my party, which is the Saskatchewan government, I reported for work in my office. I was given some pens, a book, a phone, the form to fill out to join the party, the form to fill out to make my monthly contribution, and I was given the poll that I was going to be canvassing in the by-election that was going on that day in Regina Northwest. And since, and you will know what this means, David, the by-election was being held in February, and they gave me poll number 1, which was right on the edge of the city. I got to encounter a Saskatchewan February winter in the most direct way possible.
There may have been wind. There may have been wind.
There was. It wasn't just wind. It was highlighted that some people think that province is uninhabitable, but they're wrong.
For all of you non-Saskatchewanians in Canada listening, in the weather reports in Saskatchewan in February, they tell you what the wind chill is, and then they add an additional little factoid. Exposed flesh freezes in X number of seconds.
Yeah. Now go canvassing. So anyway, all this to say, look, when you take on a job like that, you're joining the political team in the government. Okay, and there's something to say about this, which in a way Ian is dancing around, which is if your own political staff don't support your government, you've got a problem. Okay, and this incident it emphasizes how much pressure the tragedy in Gaza is putting on governments. But secondly, it does raise an issue about a late-term government, arguably, that's having a hard time holding together. And I would take this as a very negative sign that political staffers feel free to do this. Usually young political staffers are thinking about the next 5 years, the next 10 years, how they're going to do. When they think they're not going to be around for a long time, they start to do stuff like this. That's not a good sign.
Tim?
So, I start with the assumption, but maybe because I'm, I think there is a generational thing happening, by the way. And I think there is in younger people more generally less of a willingness to go along with a corporate view, a political view, a dominant view. I think there is generally a sense there we have, an entitlement to our own views that those of us who've been around to a long time don't think is appropriate in the context of being a staffer. I think I agree with your view that, to be honest with you, people would ask me when I was a staffer what I thought, and I said, it doesn't actually matter what I think, right? And what I think, I tell the minister, but the minister decides. And then I have the minister's opinion, effectively, right?
Right. No
different than a cabinet function. I may have individual views as a cabinet minister, but once the cabinet decides, I have the cabinet view, and that's the job. And you may remember, same thing. We encourage staffers to donate to the Liberal Party, strongly encouraged. That's an aspect of the job. May not be in your formal job description, but you are you're at the whim of a minister or an MP or whatever, but in this context, a minister. So I think one of the things that, I tend to agree, I don't know who the 52 are, but my guess is a lot of them are young, on the younger, newer end in the political experience. And so and the other thing I think is happening, to be fair, is there's enormous pressure inside the Muslim community. I think you seeing, a high degree of unhappiness with the policy of the government and Western governments more broadly in Muslim communities. Nuance has disappeared in the discussion of this issue, broader political thing, the realpolitik of where we sit in the G7, where America is, what Iran is doing, all of that is noise in there's a good or a bad. And I think that plays out a bit in this. I think the fact that, and so I think part of what is driving this is both the youth is a community pressure that's very difficult to withstand. And you're seeing that in that kind of 100 fundraisers who have left, won't fund the party as long as it has the position it has. The Muslim community fundraisers. And so it's a challenge in the broader community. But I think the notion of putting it on paper and expressing in public, as opposed to just quietly saying, if you're going to do something to me, do something to me. But, until this is fixed, I'm going to not be public. I mean, as you and I know, there's only 3 times the staffer goes public. And at that, it's always as an unnamed source. When something's going wrong and you're trying to find someone to blame, so you're off out to talking to a reporter. Secondly, when the staffer's trying to show that they know more than they do and they want the reporter to think they're a good thing. Or 3, at times of power struggle, when there's a fight over, who's going to be the next leader. Other than that, you shouldn't be in the news cycle at all. If you're in the news cycle, you're a problem. And I think, frankly, these 52 have created a problem, right? They're creating an opportunity for the NDP to win the Salamar, a seat that you and I, have an emotional attachment to. It's Paul Martin's seat. And the notion that they would cause that trouble for the government, to be honest with you, raises, in my view, the question of, are they in the right job?
Totally. I mean, Ian, it is totally legitimate for a fundraising person, a person that raises money for the party, to say, I'm unhappy with this policy, I'm not raising money right now. That's totally legitimate decision for that person to make. These people, shouldn't they have quit? Shouldn't they have quit? I mean, they are not in that. They're not in that position. I mean, surely the people. There's a couple hundred people that are employed to be Liberals in the whole government apparatus, and they're now saying, "Well, we're not Liberals." I mean, how is that tolerable? Now, actually, the question I want to ask you, though, is really this. Somebody who's quite senior and having run offices like this said to me, this is the culture they created. Do you think there's anything to that?
Well, that could be. I mean, look, I never wanted to push a staffer to the point of having to make a decision whether they needed to quit or not. And let me be clear. I don't agree with the view that the staffers have expressed. I'm on the other side of this debate. So I reject their position outright. I don't want to leave any suggestion here that I'm somehow sympathetic to the substance of their issue. I'm talking about the political management challenge here as the chief of staff.
Yeah.
I never wanted to push somebody on their personal beliefs to the point where they felt they had to make a decision between their most inner held belief on whatever, fill in the blank. There could be a lot of different issues here, and continuing to work for the government if they were otherwise comfortable being a conservative staffer, if they were comfortable with the government's direction and so forth. Yeah, we should work around that. I think maybe we're just used to answering more internal dissent or a wider range of internal positions inside the Conservative Party than inside the Liberal Party, and that's possible here. I think in this case, yes. If the question that was put to them was, either you're going to LaSalle Mark because we really need help against the NDP or whoever they're worried about in that riding, or there's going to be trouble. Well, then, yeah, you if it's that big a problem, you should quit here. I do think the idea that somehow the political staff organize themselves to be checks and balances against the minister or against the cabinet's direction here of, in this case, foreign policy and domestic policy is a really bad idea. I think the idea that the political staff have their own institutional standing as a force within government is a really bad idea. The political staff are there to be servants of the ministers that they're supposed to be serving, and the prime minister they're supposed to be serving, and the government they're supposed to be serving. And if you're not suited for that kind of work, you should get out. I even think Tim's three exceptions and when it's okay to go off the record and chat to
I didn't say they were okay. I said that's what happens.
I'm not sure I buy that either. I think it's actually bad precedent to set that too. But what I'm wondering here is, you've got 50 staffers who obviously wanted to say this in public, like who forced them into that corner, even if the party's got a really strong interest in winning LaSalle Mark, obviously it does, and is really worried about it. Like there are other things that staffers could do to help the cause that shouldn't put them in a position like this.
Okay.
I mean, I think you could add one more thing to this. It's interesting, Ian, that you raised the question of a pro-life, pro-abortion issue. So we're talking here about issues of conscience,
right?
And let's look at it from a chief of staff point of view. You need to be thoughtful about respecting issues of conscience. And this issue, that issue, has of course been with us for a very long time. And I think you look for ways to be respectful of issues of conscience that don't require the person to leave your team because they're acting honorably. But I think when when the line that is crossed is not, I can't work on that because it's an issue of conscience, I feel otherwise, okay, which you should respect. And two, as we were joking about earlier, as a political staffer who is on the payroll as a political worker, becoming politically helpful to the political opponents of the government, okay, that is, you have crossed the line. You don't understand your role as a political staffer. So on that one, if these folks, kind of we're all saying this, if these folks feel that they have to go public with this view and that they want to leverage their role as political staffers to damage the government to try to force it to do something, then I don't get how you feel that you then stay on the payroll.
Yeah.
That's where you've gone a bridge too far, I think.
Yeah, I think we're at the point of aggressively agreeing.
Yes.
The difference, like we all have had to manage in our roles, people who have personal philosophical issues, and and I think those are things we have an obligation to manage around and successfully accommodate those differences of views. It's the public expression of that in a way that undermines the political objectives of the government that is the problem. And I wanted to address your question, David, about culture. it's a little difficult for, the culture of open communication, the culture of having views, the culture of expressing opinions. That's actually a good thing. I don't have a problem with that. It's tough for me to believe that the government has created a culture of allowing people to publicly express contrary views. In fact, the critique of this government has been the exact opposite, which is that it's a pyramid that has at its top only one position and everything goes through the PMO. So I'm not sure that critique of culture of this sounds very accurate. I think it reflects a bunch of people who have legitimate concerns about what's happening in Gaza, who have faced enormous community pressure around the issue, who have genuine concerns, and all of which are legitimate and important. I think the step too far is then signing a letter that allows it to be in the public domain that they have those views that helps an opposition party. That's the bridge too far, as Cornelius Ryan once said.
When I was thinking about culture, I was wondering whether that from the beginning, the Trudeau team's description of this as a movement rather than a political party changed people's perceptions of what they were involved in.
I can't imagine that still applies.
Well, it's still a movement. It's just a smaller movement.
A smaller movement that has trouble moving. Look, you guys can tell me whether you think, not to get all poli-sci here, but, institutions have their own value in our system of government, and whether the Liberal Party still sees itself as an institution that has interests that transcend those of individual members or even the leader of the party, I don't know. I follow the internal governance struggles of the Liberal Party as an outsider here, but that's my primary worry about it. And I wonder about the extent to which, you don't really have to pay to be a member. You can click some like button on a Facebook page and get a vote in a leadership race. It's all personality of a single person. It's a movement, not a party. We really don't want to be a party because we don't want to be an institution. We want to be a movement because it can be anything you want it to be. I worry about that in the long term. Yeah.
All right, guys.
That's a bigger topic.
Yeah, this is a big topic. Maybe for next time.
That is a big topic.
Maybe for next time. Listen, thank you so much. What a great conversation. I had a blast talking with you. Thanks for making the time late on a long weekend afternoon.
Yeah, it's great to be part of it. Thanks, David.
Thanks, happy Labor Day, Brian, and everybody else. Well,
and
the fall.
And to you all.
Thank you.
Absolutely. See you later, brothers. I got to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail, and I got to thank all of you Herle Burly-ites out there who watched or listened to this show. Thanks for coming back this week, and there will be something again next week if you check in.